going to be very brief to introduce Brian Victoria, our keynote speaker from now. All I want to say is that Brian is always inspiring. I have seen and participated with Brian on a few different occasions, a panel discussion, and watched his talks. He's always inspiring, challenging, and provocative. Okay, I've left his talks or discussions or our discussions together and visited shrines that he's talked about, Shinto shrines, changed my perspective on issues, ideas. So it's always a pleasure to look forward to listening to Brian. It's a pleasure to introduce him to you. And the title of his talk, Zen Terror, Killing Compassionately. It's not about euthanasia. I can assure you that. It will be a really challenging talk, and he's promised that he has a lot to talk about. So we'll start now. Thank you, Brian.
And thank you, Dexter. Is the sound okay?
I think it is.
All right. Okay, well, greetings to everyone, and thank you for participating today. As the title of my presentation indicates, the first question I'm going to ask is whether it's possible to kill another human being acting out of compassion. What do people think? A second and related question is whether it's ethical to kill one or more human beings if, in doing so, you're able to save the lives of many other human beings. However, instead of examining these questions abstractly, I would like to introduce a historical incident in which, as we will see, the Zen Buddhist-related terrorists who carried out a series of assassinations believed their actions were both compassionate and expressions of killing the few in order to save the many. Next, please. Are we okay? Are we on the next slide?
Yes.
All right. Let me begin by providing the historical context for the assassinations I'll describe. Concretely, I refer to Japan as it was in the early 1930s. During the period from 1930 to 32, Japan experienced the deepest economic downturn in its modern history, prompted by the Great Depression of October 1929. Raw silk was then Japan's single largest export, and the depressed demand for silk meant financial hardship for both farmers and factory workers. The situation was further aggravated by a series of poor harvests in northern Japan at the beginning of the 1930s. Added to this was a growing population and a political establishment catering to the needs of the zaibatsu, or large financial combines. The social basis for political instability was firmly in place. Needless to say, this led to a rise in labor unrest and a crackdown on left-wing political activities. Next, please. In the northeastern Tohoku region of Japan, poor harvests resulted in many malnourished children, seen here eating raw daikon radishes. Next, please. As this photo shows, poor tenant farmers were forced to sell their daughters into prostitution. This rural disaster caused much anger and popular criticism against both the government and big business. Next, please. The right-wing solution to this situation was the call for a Shōwa restoration. Its chief goal was the restoration of full political power to Emperor Hirohito, who, as a benevolent living god and arahitogami and father figure, would end corrupt politics and create a socially just society. Some advocates also wanted to implement economic policies based on National Socialism as advocated by Kitaiki. This would be coupled with the continued expansion of the Japanese empire abroad. using military force when necessary. Domestically, communism was to be crushed, with the Soviet Union regarded as Japan's greatest external enemy. Note, however, that Kitaiki's National Socialism was not copied from the Nazis, for Kita had first proposed his solution in a book written in 1923, predating Hitler's Mein Kampf by 2 years. Next, please. The main obstacle to the establishment of the Shōwa restoration was the existence of a functioning democracy, complete with a parliament known as the Diet, composed of multiple political parties, and a cabinet, including the prime minister, made up from elected members of these parties. In other words, Emperor Hirohito had to share a great deal of political power with the democratically elected governments. It was the government that took the initiative in establishing political and economic policies. The government also had control of the military's budget for both the Imperial Army and Navy. Next, please. In Japanese history books, the Blood Oath Corps incident, known as the Ketsumedan, is presented separately from the May 5th incident, the Goichigo Jiken. However, the two incidents were composed of members of just one group, consisting of both civilians and lower-ranking military officers and cadets. The original planning called for the members to act together, but the outbreak of the Shanghai incident in January 1932 meant that the military members were unavailable before May 1932. Therefore, Inoue Nisshō, the civilian head of the group, decided that the civilians would act first, with the expectation that the military members would launch a second round of attacks when they returned from Shanghai. Next, please. If Inoue looks like a tough and ready man, that's exactly what he was, having originally been a spy for the Imperial Army in Manchuria. For any of you interested in learning more about Inoue, I recently wrote his biography in a book called Zen Terror in Pre-War Japan, Portrait of an Assassin. Next, please. Inoue Junnosuke was the first to be assassinated. He was a leader of the Rinzai party who had been finance minister from 1929 to 31. He pursued a deflationary policy in order to eliminate weak banks and inefficient firms. He also sought to restore the yen to gold convertibility at its old pre-World War I rate. Coupled with this was his campaign to induce households to reduce their consumption, all of which combined to make the severe depression in Japan even worse. Next, please. Dan Takuma was the second victim. He was the Director General of Mitsui, one of the leading allegedly corrupt financial combines. He advocated cooperating with the U.S. and opposed the imperial military's invasion of China, seeking to protect Japanese interests through diplomacy. Next, please. Prime Minister Inoue Tsuyoshi was the third victim. He had long struggled to control the imperial military's actions in China, including the establishment of the puppet country of Manchukuo in Manchuria in 1932. This led to his assassination on May 15, 1932, and effectively marked the end of civilian political control over government decisions until after World War II. Next, please. Let me add at this point that I suggest the key question to be asked of any terrorist incident is who stands to benefit in one way or another from a particular act of terrorism. This is just as important, if not even more important, than who actually carried out the attack, especially when it is a major terrorist attack. This is because major terrorist attacks require both time and money to plan. Thus, someone is providing the monies necessary to make these attacks possible. The behind-the-scenes terrorists, who are seldom identified or arrested, are in fact the real terrorists. In this case, Emperor Hirohito was clearly the beneficiary, for his political power and that of his advisors was greatly enhanced with the demise of Taisho democracy. Next, please. Let us now examine the Zen Buddhist connection to this terrorist incident. Inoue Nisshō, the head of the terrorist band, was also the head of a temple named Rissho Gokokudo, which means the temple to protect the country by establishing righteousness. It was a newly built temple and not affiliated with any Buddhist sect. Thus, although Inoue was only a lay Zen practitioner, he could nevertheless act as the temple's head. This is a photo of the temple as it appears today in the seaside village of Owarai, north of Tokyo, near Mito City. It is now affiliated with the Nichiren sect. Next, please. Inoue's Zen master was Yamamoto Gempō, abbot of the famous Rinzai Zen temple of Ryutakuji, located in Mishima, south of Tokyo. He remains one of the most highly respected of Japan's modern Zen masters, despite his support for the terrorist acts of his disciple. Next, please. As temple head, Inoue developed a rigorous training regimen for the village youth who joined his band. The regimen was designed to inculcate a do-or-die spirit and included fasting, zazen meditation, koan or Zen riddles, doksan or private interviews with the master, daimoku recitation, that is recitation of a mantra in praise of the Lotus Sutra. Inoue also taught his view of Nansen's famous killing of the monastery cat. The ultimate goal of the training was to become self-sacrificial stei-ishi, that is to become a sacrificial pawn, as in chess, a sacrificial pawn in the cause of enacting a Shōwa restoration. Next, please. Let us read this slide together, but before doing so, let me explain that the Mumonkan is a collection of 48 Zen koan compiled in the early 13th century in China. So Inoue taught that in the Mumonkan, Nansen killed the cat out of compassion. Inoue said, "Revolution employs compassion on behalf of the society of the nation. Therefore, those who wish to participate in revolution must have a mind of great compassion towards the society of the nation. There must be no thought of reward for participating in revolution. A revolution that does not encompass a mind of great compassion is not Buddhist, for revolution itself is the mind of great compassion." Next, please. This slide shows how Inoue explained what motivated him to conduct assassinations. At his trial in 1934, Inoue testified. In explaining why assassination was the most appropriate method to have employed, I would like to point out that this method required, whether successful or not, the least number of victims. The critical issue is that there was no better method than implementing what I felt sure was the best for the country, untainted by the least self-interest. Let me add here that in the northern Mahayana tradition of Buddhism, bodhisattvas, that is, those on the way to becoming Buddhas, must be ever ready to sacrifice themselves for the welfare and the well-being of others. Here, Inoue links this self-sacrificial bodhisattva spirit to committing assassinations for the good of the nation. Next, please. Onuma Shō was the member of Inoue's band who actually assassinated Inoue Junnosuke. He appears in this photo as a rather happy-looking fellow who believed his actions were both self-sacrificial and compassionate. Next, please. Once again, let us read the slide, as I would like for you to hear what these terrorists actually said. Quote, "Our goal was not to harm others, but to destroy ourselves. We had no thought of simply killing others while surviving ourselves. We intended to smash ourselves, thereby allowing others to cross over to a new society on top of our own bodies. In the process of destroying ourselves, it couldn't be helped if there were other victims. This was the fundamental principle of our revolution. A mind of great compassion was the fundamental spirit of our revolution." Next, please. The question is compassionate killing really Buddhist? The answer is that it is, at least according to the Upaya Kashaya Sutra, or the Skillful Means Sutra. This sutra contains a story about the Buddha in a former life when he was a ship's captain named Greatly Compassionate. He is seen here in a modern guise. The Buddha discerned that there was a robber on board whose intent was to rob and kill all 500 of the passengers when they were asleep. Although reluctant to take life, the Buddha ultimately decided to kill the robber. However, he did so without ill will. On the contrary, he was filled with compassion for both the would-be victims and the robber himself. Out of his compassion for the robber, the Buddha sought to prevent the robber from being reborn and suffering in hell as the karmic result of his evil deeds. Thus, on the one hand, the Buddha's act of killing is presented in accordance with the view that acts of killing are indeed instances of unwholesome karma. However, even though the negative karma resulting from his killing of the robber should have accrued even to the Buddha, it did not. For as the Buddha explained, and I quote, "Good man, because I used skillful means out of great compassion at that time, I was able to avoid the suffering of 100,000 kalpas of samsara." Samsara is the ordinary world of form and desire. "And that wicked man was reborn in heaven, a good plane of existence after death." So according to this sutra, everyone benefited from the killing, and it was done compassionately. Next, please. So it would be mistaken, however, to believe that this idea of killing one in order to save many, is something we can only see in Buddhism. In fact, we see this idea at work in both the East and West, in both pre-modern and modern times. For example, on 20 July 1944, Lieutenant Klaus von Stauffenberg and other conspirators attempted to assassinate Adolf Hitler. Stauffenberg had decided to remove Hitler after learning of the SS's mass murders of prisoners of war, the majority of whom were Jews, as well as Russians, gypsies, and gays. Could it not be said that Stauffenberg sought to kill one, that is Hitler, in order to save many? How many of us think today that he was wrong to have attempted to assassinate Hitler? Next, please. Well, what about the atomic bomb? At least 70,000 people were killed in the initial blast, while approximately 70,000 more died from radiation exposure. The 5-year death toll may have reached or even exceeded 200,000 as cancer and other long-term effects took hold, according to the Department of Energy's History of the Manhattan Project. The question is, what does this have to do with killing the few in order to save the many? In fact, isn't it true that many tens of thousands of Japanese civilians were killed by the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Next, please. Before trying to answer that question, let us first understand the sheer scale of the physical destruction. Next, please. And of course, the horrific human destruction. How could this destruction ever be justified by the belief in killing the few in order to save the many? Next, please. Nevertheless, in explaining his decision to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, President Truman stated, quote, "My object is to save as many American lives as possible, but I also have a human feeling for the women and children of Japan," unquote. The U.S. further claimed the A-bomb saved tens of thousands of Japanese lives, and the historical reality is that if the U.S. had invaded Japan as planned in the fall of 1945, no doubt many thousands, if not tens of thousands, of Japanese would have been killed. Let me also add here that, in fact, Japanese women were being trained with bamboo spears in order to go to the beaches to fight the American invaders, who, of course, had machine guns and all tanks, etc. One can only imagine the bloodbath that would have resulted. And here is a contemporary example we are all familiar with, too familiar with. 95% of the COVID-19 deaths in the United States occurred among people who were 50 or older. About 8 in 10 deaths have been among people 65 and older, according to data available from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Next, please. So let's read the slide together. Representative Trey Hollingsworth claimed that deaths due to the coronavirus were, quote, the lesser of two evils when comparing the harm to economic and American life. Supply-side economist Arthur Leffer contended it is absolutely immoral to suppress the economy and deprive future generations of opportunities. "We are crushing the economy," said Texas Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick. "There are more important things than living." In response, Richard Trumka, president of the AFL-CIO, stated, "Implicit in that is there is a certain number of people that we are willing to sacrifice, or they can die in order for the economy to open for the rest of us." So essentially what is being said in this slide is that it is acceptable for a few, mostly elderly individuals, to die in order to promote or protect the economic well-being of the many. One can only wonder what Hollingsworth or Patrick would say if their own parents or grandparents were among the dead whose lives could have been spared. That said, it does raise the question of how much a human life is worth. Next, please. And we're at the conclusion. So let me conclude with what I call lessons for today. Here I speak primarily of the ongoing menace of religion-sanctioned violence. Today, many, if not most, observers in Western countries identify such violence as connected to Islam. However, as this presentation reveals, it can be connected to Buddhism as well, especially in the Japanese Zen tradition. However, it is also true that all of the world's major religions have, at one time or another in their long histories, endorsed the use of violence, including warfare. I suggest that social injustice is the basic cause of religious violence. Yet it is also true that religion can be used to convince believers that killing may be a compassionate act, a self-sacrificial and therefore a just act, leading to the creation of an ideal society in which religion and the state have become one. If we sincerely want to eliminate religious terrorism, whether Buddhist, Muslim, Christian, Hindu, or Jewish, the first and foremost requirement is the elimination of social and economic injustice. Although I claim that religion is not the root cause of violence, it readily becomes a tool the rich and the powerful in society can manipulate to maintain their privileged positions, thereby preventing the creation of truly socially and economically just societies. If you agree, I invite you to join with me in striving for a better, more humane future for us all. Thank you for your attention, and let me now invite questions and comments. Before speaking, however, I would ask that you first identify yourself by name and affiliation, if any. So, thank you, everyone, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.
Okay, thank you, Brian. As usual, very provocative, and lots that we can think about. What we'll do is I'll wait a little while. People can write their questions in chat. So I'll wait for that as well. If people want, nobody has written so far, I think, but I'm going to search through there. If they do,
you're welcome to start with a question.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions for you. I just want to check that I'm not missing any questions there. Okay, so some of the things I was thinking about when you were talking and showing those some quite terrible images.
Yes,
but,
yes.
Really, but your ideas also are really challenging. So thinking about Japan, and not so much a kind of official religious perspective, but killing in Japan in terms of suicide, killing oneself for different reasons in Japan, in terms of the death penalty. The perspectives and the kind of feeling and thinking behind it is quite different, I think, in Japan than places that I'm familiar with. Do you think that comes from not official religious or Buddhist policy or stance, but does it a lot of the acceptance of suicide as understandable as kind of understanding the sacrificing of one's life? Is that coming from a Buddhist sort of a underlying Buddhist upbringing?
Okay, you've asked a question out of my pay grade, Dexter, as always. But one can certainly understand, I think, we see in suicide in Japan the feeling on the part of the person who's committing suicide that they have brought shame to not only to themselves but to their family, and that the way to make amends for that is for them to eliminate themselves. I don't really see, for example, I don't see a Buddhist dimension in that at least the Bodhisattva, who also is used as a paradigm for killing and for self-suicide, he or she is doing that for the benefit of others. So you could perhaps say that you could perhaps claim that the person who has shamed themselves and their families are doing it to benefit their families by eliminating themselves. And so I suppose by that stretch of the imagination, you could join that to Buddhism. But I feel more that the Confucian aspect of that is primarily at work there.
Okay.
In that you have the Confucian ideal is to create a harmonious society, and that you have whatever you've done that has shamed yourself and your family has served to destroy that harmonious society, and that you are getting out of the way to restore harmony.
Okay.
But that may be too going too far too. So we'll just put that out, and maybe some other people will want to
Okay.
comment on that
Okay.
as well. Do we
Okay.
have any other comments now?
Yes, there is a question in chat from Sunjun Kim. So
Let me see if I'll click on chat here and see if I can.
yes.
Okay, all right, I can see them some now here. All right, please go ahead.
So I'll read it aloud in case
Yes,
some people
may not
not
see it.
see the
That's right.
chat. Yeah. Okay. So can we say utilitarianism is the spirit of sacrificing the few for the majority in Zen Buddhism, or is it different from simple utilitarianism in that this behavior comes from compassion?
Well, I'm certain, of course, utilitarianism is a Western construct. So I'm always wary of joining Eastern and Western construct together easily. Although it's true, at the end of my talk, I tried to present the idea that this idea of killing the one or the few in order to save the many is certainly as we can see it operating in both the East and the West. So, my understanding, at least, of utilitarianism would be that if it works, do it, and or if it works, it's okay to do it. And so, from that, I'm unaware, at least at the moment, that utilitarianism has a compassionate dimension to it. To me, those values like compassion and love, for example, are certainly have a religious spirit to them. So, therefore, I would think that utilitarianism, as I understand it at the moment, doesn't encompass compassion, but I may be wrong. But that's my feeling at the moment.
Okay, that's a great question. That's a great question. I feel the same way as you. Actually, I was thinking. I mean, it started me thinking, what exactly is compassion?
Yes.
Okay, and
Yes.
we have it as a psychological positive emotion or virtue,
Yes.
but as a religious, the religious emotion, I guess,
Yeah. Or an ideal.
or an ideal. Yep,
Yeah.
yep, yep.
But one of the things, I would like to mention here, my feeling that notice that Buddhists typically in English, we use the word compassion rather than love. A Christian would typically use the word love. And if you were to ask me, at least, what is the difference between love and compassion, I very much like the English word compassion, because it is two words, come with, and passion, feeling. So that you are sharing the feeling of the other with you are sharing the other's feeling. Now, from the Buddhist ideal, and this is the ideal, uh, you meditate in order to realize not only that your own ego is essentially ultimately empty, but in doing so, you realize, or you join together with, if you will, the ultimately non-existent egos of all sentient beings, and in fact of all things that exist, because everything has that basic identity, the basic identity of change. And therefore, what you are doing is that you are not, Brian Victoria, am not being compassionate with Dexter De Silva, but I and Dexter De Silva are ultimately one entity. And so the Dexter De Silva's pain and suffering are indeed my pain and suffering. And out of that comes a desire to lessen not simply my pain and suffering, but to lessen Dexter's, to lessen others' pain and suffering. And so, in that sense, I find compassion to be, at least for a Buddhist, a more meaningful word than love. And so there is, in that there is that ideal that we are to feel what others feel, and that we are to reach out to them, not because they are the other, but because they really are our true selves.
Interesting, Brian, again, as usual. But what you've made me think of now is in psychology, there are many theories of love and ideas about love, different kinds of love.
Yes.
One theory is about a triarchic kind of love situation. One end of the triangle is passionate love.
Yes.
And generally at the start of relationships. Another angle of the triangle is companionate love.
I'm sorry, one more time.
Companionate love.
Companionate love. That's a new word for me. All right.
Kind of it's like friend or friendly.
Okay, friendly love.
Without any passion, for example.
Yes, yes.
And then the third end of the triangle is something called compassionate love.
All right.
And generally in that theory, it's seen as the ideal type of love relationship, especially after a period of, say, a marriage or a relationship going from passionate to compassionate as being kind of the ideal type of progression.
Yeah.
And so the idea of compassion as being maybe a integral part of ideal relationships, ideal love relationships, or is that how you see it?
Well, except that I would think that within the Christian framework, it's still, I am one individual who is compassionate for another, for the other who is also a separate individual.
Okay.
Right? Okay. Whereas the Buddhist would believe, Zen Master Dogen had a very famous statement. He said, to study Buddhism is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. All right? To forget the self is to remove the barriers between oneself and everything else that is other. Right? So to realize that unity with the other, and so from that point of view, compassionate ultimately is compassionate not for the other, but for one's true self.
Okay.
Now, whether that really makes a difference or not, that's up, for others to decide. But at least that's, I would say, is the Buddhist ideal. Yes. But as we can see in my presentation today, that ideal can be hijacked to promote terrorism.
Yes.
And I think what's really perhaps frightening about any of these ideals is that often when you get in discussions with religious people and say, well, look, Buddhism promoted terrorism, they say, oh, no, that's not. See, that's the wrong understanding. Buddhism really has this wonderful, beautiful ideal. But too few religious people, I believe, are willing to recognize that their wonderful ideals and ideas can, in fact, be hijacked to serve some horrendous purposes.
Good point. And I think we have a comment from a question from Facebook, which might address that issue.
All
actually. It's from Penny Datu on Facebook. Does sacrificing others to benefit the many negate human rights? If so, when human rights are abused, then there would be no justice. So where's the justness of this act of sacrificing lives?
All right. That's a great question. But, here is the problem that we run into. You say human rights. Whose human rights? All right. We normally think of human rights as the human rights of the individual. The human right of the individual to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, to use an American expression of that. All right. But then, what of the human rights of the others? And of course, the easiest example of that is Hitler. All right. So those people who were going to assassinate Hitler were certainly going to deprive him of his human right to live. On the other hand, that would have possibly led to saving thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of the human rights of others. Now, how do you compare, how do you weigh the human rights of one individual versus the human rights of hundreds? Actually abusing the human rights of many, many others. And therefore, I wish I had an answer, but I don't.
Well, I think your comment is a good answer, which, I mean, it's a kind of another develop further of the question, but you're right. I think whose human rights is a good follow-up question answer, I think. We do have one more
All right.
long comment question.
Yes. Please go ahead.
And it's from the same person who asked
Yes.
about utilitarianism. It is a very interesting presentation in that it points out something unconsidered aspect in a moral emotion discourse. According to P.F. Strawson, I don't know who that is.
Neither do I.
Okay. We hardly have a strictly objective attitude toward others when we see others as appropriate objects of emotional reactive attitudes. And he argued that holding an agent morally responsible for an action is nothing more than having such feelings or reactive attitudes towards him. However, your presentation sheds light on the possibility that we considered others very objectively by calculating numbers of life while still holding an emotional attitude, compassion. It was very thought-provoking. Thanks. That was your intention, wasn't it?
Well, all right. Let's see if I could comment on that at least a little bit here. One of the things I think, I wasn't really able to stress today is that unfortunately this was their actions. Inoue and his band's actions were very goal oriented, and I think this is also often very true. We focus, for example, on the people who died, but from the point of view of the people who were doing the killing, they may not even have felt particularly angry or emotionally connected with the individual they killed. What they had in their goal was these people were the people they assassinated in their minds were people who were preventing the emperor from assuming full political power. And their belief was, and this I think is very heavily Confucian oriented, is that the emperor was the father of the Japanese people, and that in a Confucian society, on the one hand, it's true that the subordinates must be absolutely loyal to the superior. That's a key element. But at the same time, the superior must act benevolently to the inferior. And so they really believe that if they could just get rid of these corrupt politicians and these corrupt business people, that when the emperor was restored, when political power was restored to the emperor as the benevolent father of the Japanese people, he would redistribute the land to the tenant farmers. He would end selling farmers' daughters into prostitution. He would put safeguards, or he would limit the wealth of these rich businessmen. He might even nationalize some of their industries, the National Socialism. So they were very goal-oriented with the belief that the emperor he was the savior of the nation, and that these people had to be eliminated in order for this ideal society to take root. And so I think, the emotional reactive attitudes are in that sense less important than the goal orientation of the assassins in this case. Thank you.
Okay.
How are we doing for time?
Interesting. I think we will need to wrap up now, but I'll just read you one last question,
All
which
right.
maybe might be a question to think about for
Okay.
later. Where it's just 11 now, but this is from Jelena Haynes on Facebook, and I wonder if she's my friend Jelena Haynes. I'm not sure, but she might be in the traditional context. So I think she's talking about like in indigenous communities or
All right.
dealing with our current issues. We forget to deal with the root cause of the problem.
Yes. And I think that is so very true. That you know, you look at 9/11 in the U.S., and of course it was a terrible, nearly 3,000 people died, and so a terrible, unforgivable, if you will, incident. But yet, how few people in America or especially in the U.S. look at the background, what led up to this, and everyone wants to perceive themselves as the victim. Very few people are willing to look at themselves as the victimizer, and I certainly think that's one of the key. Again, aside, there's one in looking at a terrorist incident. Always ask who's providing the money, who's the person behind the scenes, who stands to benefit. But at the same time, we have to look at ourselves and we have to ask ourselves, if we're honest, what have we done to provoke this action? Right. Okay, so
Yep.
we're out of time, and thank everyone for participating, and I look forward to the next time.
Well, thank you very much, Brian.
All right.
And yeah, I do, and I think we all do look forward very much to the next time in person, hopefully.
Yes, hopefully.
But thank you again,
right.
Brian, and everybody for joining wherever you are. We will have a break now before, if you look at your program, you'll see the sessions. But if you can give maybe a reaction to Brian, some kind of reaction, either visually or using the Zoom function. And thank you again, Brian.
You're welcome. And also, critical reactions are very welcome as well. I can always do better the next time, I hope. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Brian.